In the spring of 1919, the town of Gettysburg was quiet again. The guns had been silent for more than half a century, but the land still felt heavy, as if memory itself had weight. On a grey April afternoon, a small crowd gathered inside the Adams County Historical Museum for an exhibition of newly restored Civil War battlefield photography. The curator, a modest man named Elias Rowe, stood beside a glass projection screen. In his hands, a freshly developed glass plate negative, recently uncovered from an estate attic. The label read, "Gettysburg Ridge, July 3, 1863. The lights dimmed." A soft hum filled the room as the image appeared, a panoramic view of the ridge after battle. Smoke, scattered debris, the faint outline of fallen men. But as Rose slowly magnified the far ridgeline, a quiet gasp broke the silence. 3 soldiers, standing, clear as day. Their faces, not ghostly but unmistakably human, looked directly toward the lens. Their uniforms were faded Union blue. One had a hand resting on the shoulder of another. They appeared alive, but their names, later compared by Rowe, matched 3 men listed as missing in action since that very day in 1863. The museum fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the hall, described later by visitors as a cold breath across the spine. No retouching, no double exposure, no trick of light, confirmed by experts who inspected the plate weeks later. The story might have ended as a curious artifact, until a local historian, paging through an unrelated 1902 Veterans Reunion photograph, noticed something impossible. In the back row, among living men now old and grey, stood a figure wearing the same Union coat, with the same face, as one of those long-missing soldiers from 1863. And that discovery birthed a question that would haunt historians for generations. If a photograph captures a moment in time, can it also capture a soul that refused to leave it? To understand the photograph that unsettled Gettysburg, one must begin with the land itself. Even today, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, seems to breathe the weight of July 1863. The rolling fields, once golden with wheat, were torn open by cannon fire and soaked in rain and blood. Over 50,000 men fell here in just 3 days, soldiers whose faces, names, and stories blurred into the soil they fought upon. By the turn of the 20th century, the battlefield had become a place of solemn pilgrimage. Families came to find markers of those who never returned. Veterans stood in silence where their regiments once charged, and among them, a quiet obsession took hold, the desire to preserve every scrap of the past before it faded entirely. It was through that obsession that the photograph surfaced. The image, later catalogued as glass plate G2917, was discovered not by a historian, but by an amateur collector named Harold Whitby. Whitby was known in eastern Pennsylvania as a meticulous restorer of damaged negatives, a man with steady hands and a patient temperament. In 1918, while sorting through the remnants of an estate auction, he purchased a weather-stained trunk. Inside, wrapped in decayed linen, was a bundle of broken photographic plates. One, nearly intact, bore a faint inscription on its edge, "Winters, Gettysburg Ridge." Whitby's curiosity deepened when he realized that Winters could only mean Isaac Winters, a Civil War photographer and field correspondent whose images had once appeared in Harper's Weekly. Winters was documented as having worked near Cemetery Ridge in July of 1863. After months of careful cleaning and chemical stabilization, Whitby revealed what lay beneath the corrosion, the panoramic battlefield scene that would later ignite so much speculation. The image was authenticated through multiple sources. Its serial markings matched camera stock used between 1862 and 1864. The exposure technique aligned with Winters's surviving plates, now preserved in the Library of Congress Civil War Archive. The topography corresponded precisely to the southern ridge as it appeared at dawn, days after the fighting ceased. By September 1919, the plate debuted publicly at the Gettysburg Historical Hall. The museum's catalogue confirmed its chain of custody. Donated by Harold Whitby, acquired from private estate, verified Winters' original. Today, the same glass plate remains part of the Whitby Estate Collection in Philadelphia, stored under climate control, its negative scanned and digitized for research access. What began as an ordinary archival recovery, a simple act of preservation, was about to become one of the most debated photographs in American history. Because within its grain of silver and glass, something impossible waited to be seen. When the restored image was first magnified beneath the curator's glass, what should have been a simple landscape, a ridge of torn earth, a few scattered rifles, the pale outline of smoke still clinging to the horizon, revealed something no one expected. There, at the far edge of the frame, 3 men stood side by side. Their uniforms bore the unmistakable insignia of Union soldiers: blue tunics, shoulder straps, the faint gleam of brass buttons. Even their regimental patches could be discerned with unusual clarity, for a plate exposed more than half a century earlier. Their faces, though softened by age and emulsion decay, were unnervingly distinct, eyes visible, expressions calm, as though the battle had passed them by entirely. Local historians, intrigued but skeptical, invited the town's genealogical society to examine the photo. Over the following weeks, comparisons were drawn between the magnified prints and surviving portraits from family records kept at the Adams County Historical Society. The results unsettled even the most rational minds. The 3 figures appeared to match the likenesses of Private James Corbin, Sergeant Elias Burke, and Corporal Nathaniel Hayes, all men officially listed as missing in action after the Battle of Gettysburg, July 3, 1863. Their regiment, the 19th Pennsylvania Volunteers, had been stationed near the southern ridge during a little-documented skirmish locals later called the Hollow Ambush. Records suggest a dense fog rolled in that morning, separating a forward company from its command. When the smoke cleared, nearly 24 soldiers had vanished without trace. No bodies, no burial records, only silence and the echo of rifle fire swallowed by mist. That alone might have been a tragic footnote in a brutal war. But what came next blurred the lines between documentation and the unexplainable. In early 1864, a surviving lieutenant's report made a brief and unsettling mention of moving shadows seen at dawn along the abandoned ridge, as though figures lingered where none should stand. The notation was dismissed as fatigue-induced vision, yet the phrase remained preserved in official dispatches. A month later, a private's letter sent from a nearby encampment spoke of a similar sighting. "There are 3 of them," he wrote, "always together, standing still where no men are." For decades, those fragments lay buried in the margins of Civil War correspondence, until Whitby's photograph brought them back into focus. The alignment was too precise to ignore. 3 men, the same ridge, the same number described in the old reports. Scholars proposed conventional explanations. Some suggested photographic error, perhaps a double exposure caused by Winters accidentally overlaying a previous plate. Yet restoration analysis refuted that theory. No evidence of emulsion overlap appeared under chemical or spectral examination. The light diffusion and shadow gradient confirmed a single exposure, unaltered since its original development. Others pointed to psychological projection, the human mind's tendency to find faces and forms in randomness. But even that rationale faltered when independent restorers produced identical results. The figures were real, not illusion, and positioned with impossible precision for coincidence. In March 1920, the Gettysburg Herald ran a front-page story that caught national attention. "The 3 who stood again. Restored photograph reveals soldiers long thought lost." The article described the discovery with both fascination and unease, calling it a moment where history blinked. Letters poured in from descendants, veterans, even theologians. Some claimed it was proof of divine witness, others of restless spirits refusing to yield to time. Then came the discovery that deepened the mystery further. When cross-referenced with another plate from Winters's Gettysburg camera series, faint outlines of the same 3 men appeared, positioned differently, as though caught moments later, though military records confirmed they had already been missing for weeks before that second image was taken. The photograph had begun as evidence of war. Now it had become evidence of something neither life nor death could easily explain. From that moment onward, the story of the 3 who stood again would no longer belong solely to history. It would belong to whatever lingers behind it. By the mid-20th century, the photograph that once hung quietly in the Gettysburg Historical Hall had become an object of academic obsession. What began as a local curiosity had evolved into a cross-generational investigation, a puzzle that refused to age, its questions lingering as stubbornly as the figures it contained. In 1946, a young photography student named Helen Rowe from the University of Pennsylvania selected the Whitby collection as the focus of her graduate thesis on early war photography. Among the fragile plates, carefully wrapped in paper and tagged with fading ink, she found the now famous image G2917, the glass negative first revealed in 1919, using ultraviolet illumination, a technique newly adapted from medical imaging. Rowe noticed something that had escaped every prior restorer's eye. Under the UV light, the silhouettes of the three soldiers shimmered with a faint halo effect, an irregular spectral residue that appeared not in the surrounding terrain, but around the men themselves. To the untrained observer, it might have seemed a trick of refracted light, but Rowe recognized it for what it was, the signature of movement, an exposure anomaly caused by a subject shifting between moments. Only these subjects, she noted, appeared impossibly sharp, as if frozen in full awareness. Her field notes, still preserved in the university archives, record a single unsettling line. The figures appear too sharp to be accidental. It's as though they stood there, knowing they were being seen. The remark would later draw attention from Smithsonian researchers, curious about how such precision could exist in a plate exposed under 19th century conditions. By 1959, the Smithsonian Division of Photographic Sciences conducted its own chemical and optical analysis. The results deepened the mystery rather than resolved it. No trace of chemical tampering was detected, no retouching, no manipulation of silver nitrate layers, no secondary exposure. But under a microscopic phase contrast test, the analysts discovered something wholly unprecedented: inverted reflection lines surrounding the soldiers' forms. Normally reflective light captured by 19th century lenses shows outward diffusion, an absorption pattern from sunlight. Yet here the pattern reversed, as though the figures had been emitting light, not reflecting it. One internal memorandum summarized the finding in cautious language: the optical pattern does not conform to passive reflection. It is consistent with self-luminous emission. For historians and scientists alike, that conclusion defied known photographic principles. It implied not illusion, but an event that had somehow recorded light emanating from the subjects themselves, a phenomenon with no rational precedent. To understand what Winters could have possibly captured, researchers revisited the photographer's personal correspondence. In 1961, letters were recovered from the Harper's Weekly archives, the same publication for which Winters had served as a war correspondent. Among invoices and notes of shipment was a single letter dated August 12, 1863, written to his editor. Some of the subjects should not have appeared. I made the exposure twice and still they stood. Perhaps the plate remembered more than I did. That haunting phrase, "the plate remembered more than I did," would become the cornerstone of modern interpretations. In the 19th century, spirit photography had captivated popular imagination. Enthusiasts claimed to capture apparitions beside the living, using deliberate double exposures or smoke reflections. But Winters was no showman. His surviving equipment, preserved in the Whitby archive, was a wet plate collodion camera, a device requiring slow exposures and precise chemical timing. Experts agree it could not have accidentally produced the figures without visible distortion or overlay. As debates persisted, new lines of inquiry began connecting the photograph to a broader pattern, one not limited to superstition, but rooted in psychological and environmental science. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, psychiatrist Dr. Jule Eisenbud, known for his studies on photographic anomalies and emotional resonance, proposed a radical theory. His research suggested that sites of extreme human trauma, battlefields, disaster zones, places heavy with loss, might hold measurable electromagnetic disturbances capable of imprinting faint optical traces. He called them residual images of emotion. Within that framework, the Gettysburg plate fit perfectly. It had not captured men returning from death. It had captured the echo of a moment so charged with human intensity that it left a physical signature, a record of presence without continuation. But as science tried to bring language to the inexplicable, Those who lived near the field spoke of something else. A retired groundskeeper named Samuel Cray, interviewed in 1932, years before Rowe's study, described walking the southern ridge during heavy fog. His statement, filed in the Gettysburg Historical Society's oral archives, reads plainly, "When the mist drops low, you can hear them under the ridge, 3 voices, close together. Always the same tones, like men murmuring prayer. No one could prove what Cray heard, but his words echoed the same number, the same quiet persistence found in every strand of evidence." By the 1970s, the photograph's reputation had shifted. It was no longer classified merely as historical artifact, but as an optical enigma, cited in lectures on visual psychology, electromagnetic theory, even theology. What had begun as a relic of war had evolved into a study of presence without passage, existence caught between time's frames, never crossing forward or fading back. Through each investigation, one truth held constant. Every attempt to define the photograph seemed to bring its subjects closer, not further away. The men of the ridge did not vanish under scrutiny. They became clearer, and with each new discovery, the line between evidence and apparition grew thinner, until all that remained was the image itself, standing silent, emitting light no one could explain. By the late 20th century, technology had finally caught up with the mystery. What generations of archivists, historians, and skeptics had argued over for decades was now placed beneath the unforgiving precision of modern digital imaging. In 1997, a research team at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Imaging and Photonics Laboratory was granted temporary access to the original Gettysburg glass plate image. During time was 7, their goal was simple: to produce the first ever high-resolution digital scan of the fragile negative, preserving it for future study. Yet what emerged on their monitors was not preservation, but revelation. When the image was digitally enhanced and analyzed at the pixel density level, researchers detected a strange irregularity. Within the density map of the emulsion, deep inside the light grains that defined the soldiers' outlines, were pulse-like fluctuations. These weren't random distortions or scanner noise. They appeared rhythmic, consistent, almost biological in tempo. At first, the anomaly was dismissed as a calibration error, but when data analyst Dr. Erin Mallory cross-referenced the pattern through multiple scan layers, the rhythm repeated with startling regularity, 68 pulses per minute. When compared against biological data sets, the fluctuation matched a resting human heartbeat. Her technical report summarized it plainly. Amplitude oscillations within emulsion microstructure correspond to organic pulse intervals. It is as if the captured light retains living rhythm. The finding drew both fascination and skepticism. No known physical mechanism could explain how a 19th century exposure, captured through primitive optics and light-sensitive chemicals, could encode something akin to a vital sign. Yet the pattern persisted across all 3 figures. Each trace held a subtly different rhythm, suggesting individuality. As the data spread quietly through academic circles, a parallel discovery emerged, one that blurred the line between science and human memory. Among the private papers of Isaac Winters, the original photographer, a collection of personal letters surfaced through his descendants in Maryland. One in particular, dated March 1866, was addressed to his wife. "Since the day of the ridge, I have dreamt of the faces that returned when I closed my eyes. Always the same 3 standing still. They do not look at me, but I know they see me." Historians reading the letter could not dismiss its weight. It suggested Winters himself had experienced the lingering presence of his subjects, not as ghosts, but as impressions upon his own mind. This intersection between the physical record of light and the inner record of memory birthed a daring hypothesis. Researchers began to speculate that severe trauma, such as that endured on Civil War battlefields, could leave measurable distortions not just in survivors, but in the surrounding electromagnetic field. A battlefield saturated with fear, grief, and mortality might, in theory, create a form of light resonance, a psychic imprint upon the environment, capable of interacting with photosensitive materials. In essence, a permanent exposure of consciousness, not body. It was an idea hovering uneasily between science and spirituality, credible enough to discuss, impossible to prove. But then came the experiment that changed everything. In 2001, 2 decades after the MIT analysis, a small interdisciplinary team of physicists, historians, and photographers revisited Gettysburg's southern ridge at dawn. Using a combination of infrared and long-exposure digital cameras, they attempted to replicate winter's vantage point and exposure timing. In 2001, 2 decades after the MIT analysis, a small interdisciplinary team of physicists, historians, and photographers revisited Gettysburg's southern ridge at dawn. Using a combination of infrared and long-exposure digital cameras, they attempted to replicate winter's vantage point and exposure timing. What the cameras recorded remains one of the most debated pieces of visual evidence in modern parapsychology. Across multiple frames, faint human contours appeared in the mist, vague yet unmistakably anthropoid. They seemed to emerge from the very air, defined by light gradients rather than solid form. The contours persisted for less than 2 minutes before dissolving as the first sunlight touched the ridge. The images, while indecisive, echoed Winter's century-old photograph with uncanny alignment. Even the positioning, 3 figures at the horizon's curve, matched the arrangement of Corbin, Burke, and Hayes from the original 1863 plate. Skeptics dismissed it as atmospheric interference, a trick of humidity and reflected heat. Yet for others, the recurrence confirmed that the site itself carried an emotional residue, reactivated under precise conditions. A resonance between past and present. It was around this same time that a final, deeply human moment altered the story's tone entirely. During the filming of a PBS documentary about the Gettysburg photograph, a modern U.S. Army veteran named Michael Corbin was assisting the crew as a historical consultant. As the newly enhanced image was projected on a large screen for contextual narration, Corbin froze. Without warning, he stepped closer to the display and whispered, almost to himself, "That's him." When asked what he meant, Corbin pointed to the leftmost figure, Private James Corbin, identified decades earlier by genealogists as one of the 3 missing soldiers. Michael explained that his great-grandfather, the same James Corbin, had been lost during the war with no known grave. Family stories spoke of his disappearance, of a final letter never delivered. For years, Michael had grown up seeing a single portrait of his ancestor, a faded daguerreotype in his mother's home. The resemblance between that image and the man in the photograph was exact. What struck the crew most wasn't his words, but his silence afterward, the look of recognition that seemed to pass between him and the figure in the frame, as though some fragment of blood memory had bridged the years. In the final narration of the broadcast, the voiceover spoke slowly, softly. Perhaps the battlefield did not end when the guns did. Perhaps some moments too powerful to fade continue to stand, waiting to be seen again. By the end of the segment, even the skeptics had grown quiet. The evidence remained uncertain, but the emotion, that lingering sense of unfinished presence, was undeniable. The convergence of science and memory had done something extraordinary. It had made the impossible feel real. Not by proving ghosts, but by proving that remembrance itself might be an energy, forever seeking form. By 2022, the photograph known as Image G29117 had already passed through the hands of historians, physicists, and skeptics alike. Every decade had peeled away another layer of mystery, only to reveal more questions beneath. But this time, something was different. A new technology, quantum resolution scanning, allowed scientists to see deeper into the microstructure of the photographic grain than ever before. The process was delicate, each pixel magnified not for color or form, but for the atomic vibration left behind when the image was first exposed to light, 160 years ago. As the scan progressed line by line, an analyst noticed something strange in the lower right corner, a series of hairline microfractures that did not follow the random chaos of age or chemical decay. They repeated in rhythmic curves. When the data was reconstructed in 3 dimensions, the pattern became unmistakable. They were fingerprints, distinct looping whorls and ridges, identical across multiple fragments of the plate. The discovery team at the Massachusetts Institute of Photonic Imaging knew instantly what it meant, but refused to believe it. To confirm, they cross-referenced the pattern with archival military enlistment documents from 1862, One card stood out: Private Eli Corbin, Union infantryman, age 23. His enlistment fingerprint, pressed in fading black ink, matched perfectly with the microfracture ridges on the photograph. It should have been impossible. Glass and light could not retain the texture of human skin, and yet there it was, frozen in emulsion, like the photograph had absorbed the very touch of the man it portrayed. But the discovery didn't end there. When the researchers enhanced the reflection data across the central figures, they found something faint, almost invisible, lurking behind the three soldiers. Not a shadow, not a trick of exposure, a fourth silhouette. Barely outlined by residual light, the figure stood slightly apart from the rest, a blurred face half turned toward the camera. The researchers compared the features to all known documentation of the photographer, Isaac Winters. The alignment was uncanny. The jawline, the posture, even the fold of his coat. The revelation sent chills through the room. Winters was never seen in any of his photographs. Not once in his entire career had his own image appeared in the glass. But here somehow he was present, faint, spectral, and standing among the dead. The working theory that emerged was as poetic as it was disturbing, that the men he captured had captured him, too. Historians began to call it the closed exposure loop, a phenomenon in which the act of photographing at extreme emotional or energetic intensity creates a feedback echo between subject and observer. In this theory, the camera becomes more than an instrument of recording. It becomes a mirror of consciousness. The light, reflecting upon itself infinitely, preserves not only the faces before it, but also the eyes behind the lens. As researchers debated the implications, the tone of the discussion shifted from scientific curiosity to quiet reverence. They were no longer asking how it was possible, but why it happened. What force, grief, or memory could bind these men together across centuries? The more they studied the photograph, the more anomalies appeared. Subtle glimmers across the soldier's eyes, faint as the shimmer of heat, minute variations in pixel, density that seemed to pulse when the image was exposed to certain wavelengths of light. And then there was the museum test. When the enhanced plate was finally placed under controlled illumination at the Smithsonian, something happened that no one expected. Under one specific range of light, a narrow, amber frequency near sunset, the photograph appeared to flicker, not a trick of reflection, not mechanical interference, a subtle, slow undulation, like the faintest movement of breath across glass. Visitors described the sensation as alive. Curators, at first skeptical, documented the effect under multiple conditions. The results were always the same. The image did not move in any measurable way, yet the human eye perceived it as though it did. The voiceover, calm yet shaken, delivers the final reflection. Perhaps the battlefield did not end when the guns did. Perhaps it continues in the silence between light and memory. Each time the image is seen, it remembers being seen. Each time it is touched, it recalls the warmth of that first hand. And perhaps after all these years, it only wants to be witnessed, so it will not fade into the darkness alone. The screen fades to the photograph one last time. Image G2917, resting beneath museum glass, steady and still. But under the low light, a single shimmer passes across the center of the plate, like a breath escaping from another world. And then silence. By the early 2000s, the mystery of image Tanger G2917 had crossed from archives into public fascination. The History Channel aired a special segment titled Echoes in Silver, the photograph that remembered. Soon after, the Smithsonian Institute hosted a traveling exhibition. Crowds lined the corridors, whispering before the glass case as if entering a chapel. Online forums erupted with theories, skeptics, scientists, spiritualists. Some argued the anomalies were nothing more than tricks of shadow, coincidence of decay and time. Others coined new terminology, emotive resonance capture, describing a process where intense emotion might inscribe itself into matter, a living memory etched in light. Across universities, psychology courses began using the image as a case study, teaching the concept of the persistence of presence, the idea that grief, when shared by many, can anchor itself in the physical world. Meanwhile, Descendants of the three soldiers, Corbin, Lyle, and Briggs, petitioned to have the photograph officially recognized as a memorial artifact. After months of review, the Gettysburg National Museum accepted. Beneath a restored copy of the photo now rest 3 small plaques, each bearing the soldiers' names and dates of service. In that moment, history folded in on itself. The forgotten finally remembered. The anonymous made human again. The public fascination slowly faded, replaced by reverence. The image no longer circulated as a ghost story, but as a quiet piece of human history. Then, in 2021, a simple, unpublicized act brought the story full circle. A park ranger at the site of the hollow ambush ridge found 3 tin buttons placed precisely where the men once stood in the photograph, arranged in perfect alignment, down to the angle of their spacing. No note, no signature, only the faint imprint of someone kneeling in the wet earth. For a moment, the past and the present seem to breathe together, one acknowledging the other. The camera pans over the empty ridge. Wind moves through the grass. The light shifts, soft and golden, as though remembering something, and then, gently, the narrator's voice returns, calm, reflective, letting silence carry meaning. Perhaps we never solved the mystery of image cranger G2917. Perhaps we were never meant to, because what it revealed was never about proof, but about presence. If war ends in silence, perhaps that silence learns to speak. For every field left quiet, there are voices that linger beneath it, not in sorrow, but in witness. Maybe these soldiers were never haunting anyone. Maybe they were only waiting to be seen properly. Their stories no longer trapped behind glass and grain. Photography was born from light, and in the laws of physics, light never truly disappears. It only changes direction, softens, bends, continues. So perhaps what we call the supernatural, here's nothing more than the persistence of the human will, the refusal to vanish completely. Every photograph is a contract between what was and what remains. It is memory folded into time, waiting for someone to look closely enough to remember again. And in that act of remembering, something moves, faintly, gently, just enough to remind us that we were never alone in the first place. In every image of the fallen, there is always one more standing, just beyond the frame, waiting to be seen again.